Well, one of our main goals in creation apologetics, kind of the brand of apologetics that we tend to focus on more in this class, is to focus on reconciling the conflicts that exist between what is being taught today as natural history and the biblical history. Well, in evaluating these teachings to determine which is the true history of the world, we need to recognize the significance that worldviews have on interpretation of scientific findings. See, everyone has a worldview, which is basically your perspective about what this world is. And when you establish a worldview, then you interpret all of your observations within this view of the world. Unfortunately, most natural scientists today hold to atheism as their worldview, and therefore we should be very skeptical about what is being taught today, in particular about ancient Earth history and or origins. Fortunately, we have the Bible, the biblical history, which provides us with some tremendously important details and insights about the early history of the world. The global flood, for example, is critical for understanding the world as it now exists and interpreting the geologic features that have been found. An interpretation of fossiliferous rock that I will add has been historically assumed throughout history. When people saw these fossils and these fossil-bearing strata, these layers of rocks, it was automatically assumed by the peoples of the world who knew of the biblical history that what they were looking at was the remains of the global flood of Noah. The book of Genesis describes this terrible flood sent by God due to the sin on the earth in those days. And there are 2 points of consideration that are stated here emphatically by the text. One, this was a global scale event. There's really no way of interpreting the reading of the text any other way. And 2, that there were no land animal or human was able to survive this event. From Genesis 7. And the waters prevailed so mightily upon the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, birds, cattle, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm upon the earth, and every man. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. So this was a global scale event. And again, no land animal or human was able to survive this event. So let me ask this question. If there was an event like the one described in Genesis, what else would we expect to find than what we actually find? We live on top of a flood wasteland. The evidence of this event is monumental and everywhere we look. There is no event in the history of the world that has more evidentiary support than the global flood. The world is covered in sedimentary rock layers hundreds of feet thick, which are laden with the fossils of dead plants and animals. However, when we consider the extent of the flood described in the Bible, that it was global, and how life was saved from the destruction through Noah's Ark, an act of supernatural intervention, it should not be hard to understand that the physical findings of this event could not be correctly interpreted within the boundaries of philosophical naturalism. See, philosophical naturalism is attempting to explain everything that we see, but the flood of Noah was not a purely natural event. See, the only reason humans survived this event, the only reason land animals survived this event, was because God told Noah there was going to be a flood, told him how to build an ark, and the animals came to Noah to be kept alive. It specifically states this in the text. So life was saved from the flood by God's actions, an act of supernatural intervention that altered the otherwise certain natural outcome of the event, and that is the death of all terrestrial life. See, God again told Noah there was going to be a flood, told him how to build the ark that would hold all of these animals, and brought the animals to him to be kept alive. This outcome precludes or prevents a correct interpretation of the event's geology within the boundaries of naturalism. See, when a naturalist looks at the world, what they see are these vast layers of sedimentary rocks, but on top of those vast layers of rocks, life exists. Lots of life. Fragile life. Fragile little organisms. You got cold-blooded animals. You have that can't survive changes in temperature. You have amphibians that couldn't survive exposures to salt water. And what a naturalist is trying to do is they're trying to interpret our world as it now exists, covered in these vast layers of sedimentary rock. But obviously, life survived the formations of all these layers, because the same life that's alive today is found embedded within these rock layers. So these animals were able to survive this event. And to a naturalist, they must have been able to survive it on their own, which means that those layers of sediments had to form slowly and gradually at a rate or in a manner in which life could have survived it on its own. But the Bible says this was an event that nothing could survive. And the only reason animals and humans survived this event was because of an act of supernatural intervention. That intervention prevents a naturalist from correctly interpreting the geology of this event. They can't do it. They cannot correctly interpret this event. Well, not only do secular scientists not have special insight like we have through the Word of God, but most are operating within a flawed worldview. See, much of science inquiry today is based on an atheistic worldview, the belief that there is no God. When atheism is applied to understand the world around us, it has led to philosophical naturalism, the view that physical phenomenon must be explained as occurring through natural processes, and the origin of everything we see must have come about through purely natural processes. This includes the earth and life on earth. This is the position that has been adopted by the scientific community. This is why scientists are referred to today as naturalists, why our science museums are typically referred to as natural history museums. See, science has got itself involved in teaching history. They're not just exploring science. They're not just figuring out how biological systems, how life works. They're not just looking at astronomy to figure out the physics of the cosmos. They're not just looking at the chemistry and physics of our world. They've got themselves involved in teaching history. They're teaching us a speculative history of the world as though it's an absolute fact. Well, when philosophical naturalism was applied to the geology of the earth, this is what led to what is called uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism was born through atheism and philosophical naturalism. So what is uniformitarianism? Well, prior to the 19th century, it was assumed that the biblical flood was responsible for the majority of the fossiliferous rock that we see on the planet. However, this is what was called catastrophism, or is today known as that. However, around 1850, the view began to develop that slow and gradual processes with uniform rates and intensities were responsible for the Earth's geologic features, like the fossiliferous rock and or erosion features that we see. This view became known as uniformitarianism. Well, the concept of uniformitarianism was ushered in by two champions of natural science of geology. One of them is shown here, James Hutton. The other is Charles Lyell. James Hutton was an anti-catastrophist who argued in his 1785 book titled The Theory of the Earth for uniformity of causes to explain the Earth's geologic features. He asserted that the sedimentary rocks are the result of a cyclic process of erosion and sediment deposition, processes that he argued do not change over time. He summarized this with his famous phrase, "No vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end." With this in mind, let's listen to the prophecy in 2 Peter about this very view. He said, "Know this, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lust and saying, 'Where is the promise of his coming?' For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation." Well, that is the prophesied view that forms the basis of uniformitarianism. Now let's read on. It's for when they maintain this view, it escapes their notice that by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was deluged, being flooded with water. Well, in 1830, Charles Lyell argued in his book titled The Principles of Geology for uniformity of intensity. He asserted that the same gradual processes occurring today were responsible for all geologic features. He summarized this with the oft-quoted saying, "The present is the key to the past." Lyell also wrote in 1830 about his agenda to, quote, "free the science from Moses," meaning he wanted to free it from a catastrophic biblical interpretation to one that is consistent with naturalism, the naturalism view of deep time. These two views, catastrophism versus uniformitarianism, debate the question of whether sedimentary rocks, like the sandstone you see here, originated by slow and gradual processes of transport or catastrophic flooding. Understand that the rocks that you see in this picture, this is sandstone, is new rock. So these sand particles were created when the older basement rocks were weathered away. Those sand particles were then transported to this new area and then deposited there. And originally, the sand was deposited at least as high as the top of those monuments. This is Monument Valley, Utah. All the way to the top of those monuments, sandstone once existed. Sand was deposited in this area up to the top of those mountains, forming a vast floodplain. Then all the sandstone that is missing in those areas, leaving the monuments behind, was eroded away. So was the sandstone deposited there slowly and gradually over long periods of time? Was it eroded away slowly and gradually over long periods of time, or in a catastrophic manner? Well, the absence of all that sand tends to suggest a catastrophic sweep away of all that material, but hey. Or we could also debate that for the Grand Canyon, where the distinct layers of rocks visible there form slowly and gradually by sediments accumulating during different epochs or epochs of time, as natural science contends today. Or was it deposited there catastrophically? And did the canyon form slowly and gradually due to the erosion of the Colorado River, as it's occurring there today? Or did it occur during a catastrophic event? But again, due to the supernatural intervention during the global flood that altered the otherwise certain natural outcome of the event, that would be the death of all terrestrial life, that event cannot be correctly interpreted by naturalists. To a naturalist, there's only one possible interpretation of these layers of sedimentary rocks that we see at the Grand Canyon. They had to form slowly and gradually over long periods of time, at a rate or manner that the animals alive today could have survived it on their own. Well, as a result of adopting uniformitarianism, most secular geologists are today highly biased against flood catastrophe as an explanatory mechanism for the Earth's geologic features. Now, this bias is well illustrated by the story of Harlen Bretz. Harlen Bretz, shown here. In the 1920s, Harlen Bretz proposed that features in eastern Washington must have been formed by large-scale flooding of catastrophic proportions. He named this area of eastern Washington the channeled scablands, where there are found channels like this, like the ones you see here, eroded through solid basalt, volcanic rock. And this is an area that sees very little moisture today. What carved out these vast canyons? Massive geologic features can be found there, such as these canyons called coulees. This is the Grand Coulee shown here, which reaches 4 miles wide and 900 feet deep. This canyon does. Well, Harlen Bretz asserted that these coulees, this is the Grand Coulee, there's another one called Moses Coulee, that these coulees formed when they were completely full of water at one point in time. Because, see, these canyons have very straight walls and very flat bottoms. But canyons that form gradually are V-shaped or U-shaped. For this canyon to have this very flat bottom and straight walls, he argued, this thing had to be filled full of water at one point in time. The flood he was proposing to account for these features was indeed monumental. Well, as you can see from this map, the area in question is vast, where the channels and coulees can be found, a good 120 miles across. The light blue that you see here is where these features are found today, where those vast coulees and canyons are found. The dark blue that you see in this figure is where the water is found there today. So very little water flowing through there today to account for those vast canyons and coulees that are seen there. The channels are cut so deep through the solid basalt, again lava rock, that they are visible even from satellite. You can see those vast canyons and coulees from this satellite photo. However, the geologic community initially thought the hypothesis that Harlen Bretz proposed was outrageous and refused the idea of catastrophic flood to form these features because most geologists, again, side by the principles of uniformitarianism. Although the scabland features display an obvious witness to a major catastrophic flood, Harlen Bretz was subject to scorn for the suggestion due to the strong bias that geologists have against catastrophic flooding as interpretations of geologic features. An article that was published in the Seattle Times in 2003 speaks to the plight of Harlen Bretz. They said, mystified by the forces that could have exposed such massive features, Bretz set out in the early 1920s to solve the riddle. He returned with a hypothesis that was dismissed as near lunacy. In a region that sees less moisture in a year than Seattle gets in a month, Bretz concluded that the entire landscape was carved by water. Bretz, according to some reports, was quickly isolated as a crank, while his critics' theories continue to make it into textbooks. 50 years later, Bretz was hailed as a hero, and in 1979, at the age of 96, he was given geology's highest honor, the Penrose Medal, which rewards one researcher each year for exceptional contributions to geology. 2 years later, he passed away. Terrible story, Harlen Bretz. Especially because today it is well recognized that the Channel Scablands was caused by a major catastrophic flood. That is today called the Missoula flood, because the source waters for this flood were centered around what is today Missoula, Montana. So what happened is a massive Ice Age lake was blocked from drainage that eventually ruptured its ice dam, and about 3,000 square miles of water plowed its way across Washington in just about 2 days, destroying and reshaping the U.S. landscape from Montana all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Many of the larger scabland features cannot be identified while standing on the ground. Several were only discovered after field researchers observed them from airplanes. For example, the rolling hills you see there. Only from the air are these rolling hills visible west of Spokane identified as giant ripple marks, similar to those that we see on a beach or in a lake shore. Yet these hills are 30 feet high and 250 feet apart. From the ground, they just look like hills. But from the air, the symmetry of these caused them to be recognized as giant ripple marks. The Missoula flood also carved out the Columbia River Gorge. It was the waters of the Missoula flood that carved out that vast gorge. The flood also transported tons of materials from eastern Washington to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Large boulders, in fact, and rocks were carried down the Columbia River Gorge can still be found around Portland. Large gravel bars were formed near Portland, such as those of the Alameda Ridge neighborhood it's built upon. There's, in fact, a state park called the Erratic Rock Natural Site that's near Willamette Valley in Oregon, where you can tour some of these erratics, these large boulders that were carried to that location by the Missoula flood. The area where Portland stands today was completely underwater during the Missoula flood. Floodwaters were over 400 feet deep and traveling at over 90 miles per hour and were equal to 10 times the discharge of all the Earth's rivers today. That's a lot of water. During the Missoula flood, a massive waterfall was formed where there is today a dry fall state park and visitor center. The back wall that you see there was once a giant waterfall. At the visitor center, there's a painting on the railing there that shows what that waterfall probably looked like. And while I was there, I took a quick video. You can see here a panning video where I shot that back wall. That back wall that you see there is where the waterfall was. And to give you an idea of how big this is, Niagara Falls, by comparison, is 1 mile wide and drops 165 feet. This waterfall at Dry Falls was 3 times larger. It was 3.5 miles wide and dropped a full 400 feet. This was a massive waterfall. Well, in 1994, the Dry Falls Visitor Center was dedicated to Harlen Bretz. This plaque can be found mounted outside the facility. It reads, "Dedicated to J. Harlen Bretz, who patiently taught us that catastrophic floods may sometimes play a role in nature's unfolding drama." And then there's a quote from Harlen Bretz there as well. He said, "Ideas without precedent are generally looked upon with disfavor, and men are shocked if their conceptions of an orderly world are challenged." Well, it took geologists more than 50 years to acknowledge that the geologic features in eastern Washington were the result of catastrophic flooding. This bias against catastrophism in geology is obviously driven by their determination to counter the biblical narrative of the flood of Noah, which has and is currently preventing the whole of the geologic community from correctly interpreting features that are otherwise fairly easy to recognize, just like the Missoula flood was. Well, with an understanding that this bias exists in geologic science today, we should be very skeptical about the interpretations of the fossil record that is taught today as though it's an established fact by natural science. See, a correct understanding of fossils and how they are formed is absolutely key to the entire debate over creation versus evolution and the young versus old age of the earth. The question is the fossil record consistent with slow and gradual accumulations of sediments or catastrophically vast formation?